April 8, 1943. The air at 27,000 feet above Caen, France, bit through leather and wool like frozen razors. Through the crystal-clear canopy of his Focke-Wulf 198-5, Oberleutnant Ralph Hermchen couldn't suppress the smirk creeping across his frost-numbed face. Even his oxygen mask couldn't hide the amusement dancing in his eyes as he watched the ungainly silhouettes climbing laboriously toward his formation through the morning light. The veteran ace of Jägerschwader 26, only 26 years old but already carrying the weight of 2 brutal years over the Channel, studied the American fighters making their combat debut over occupied Europe. His gloved hand keyed the radio transmitter, his voice crackling with barely contained laughter. "My armies have sent us flying milk bottles," he transmitted to his wingman, the words dripping with the casual arrogance of men who'd survived when so many others hadn't. Below them, 16 P-47C Thunderbolts of the 4th Fighter Group lumbered upward in tight formation, their 2,000 horsepower Pratt and Whitney R2800 double Wasp engines straining against their 7-ton weight like pack mules hauling cannons up a mountain. To German pilots accustomed to the sleek, predatory lines of Spitfires and the nimble Soviet fighters they'd faced over the endless Russian steppes, these corpulent American machines appeared almost comical, like someone had taken a fighter plane and inflated it until it was ready to burst. Everything about them seemed wrong. Barrel-shaped fuselages topped with greenhouse canopies that looked like they belonged on a bomber. Wings that seemed criminally small for bodies that massive, as if the designers had run out of blueprint paper and just stopped drawing. Propellers that dwarfed anything in the Luftwaffe inventory, spinning with a peculiar thunder that carried for miles through the thin air. They looked less like fighters and more like flying grain silos with wings bolted on as an afterthought. What Hermchen didn't know, what none of the German pilots circling like wolves above the climbing Americans could have possibly imagined in their wildest nightmares, was that they were witnessing the arrival of the weapon that would systematically, methodically, and absolutely destroy the Luftwaffe's fighter arm. Within 18 months these flying milk bottles would transform from objects of derision into instruments of terror, their 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns becoming the most feared sound in German skies, a sound that veterans would describe decades later with voices that still trembled. The mathematics of destruction were already loaded in those broad wings, waiting patiently like a coiled spring. 3,400 rounds of ammunition. A combined rate of fire of 6,000 rounds per minute. Enough concentrated firepower to saw a Messerschmitt in half in less than 2 seconds of sustained fire. But numbers on paper couldn't capture what it actually meant when all 8 guns spoke simultaneously. The sound, the fury, the absolute certainty of obliteration. The transformation would begin that very April morning when Major Donald Blakesley, commanding the 335th Fighter Squadron, spotted the German formation positioning for their attack. The former Eagle Squadron veteran, a man who'd transferred from RAF Spitfires just weeks earlier, his hands still remembering the delicate touch those British fighters required, understood something his men didn't yet know, something he'd learned through bitter experience, and the kind of tactical thinking that separated survivors from statistics. Survival in the P-47 required abandoning everything they thought they knew about air combat. Every instinct honed in lighter, more agile fighters would get them killed. The Thunderbolt wasn't a fighter in the traditional sense, it was something entirely new, and fighting it like a Spitfire or a Hurricane was suicide. The Thunderbolt represented a radical, almost heretical departure from conventional fighter design philosophy. While the Germans had spent years pursuing lightweight interceptors optimized for climb rate and turn performance, fighters that danced through the sky like fencers, all grace and agility, Republic Aviation had created something unprecedented. A high-altitude juggernaut that used mass, raw power, and overwhelming firepower to rewrite the fundamental rules of aerial warfare. It didn't dance. It didn't need to. It hammered. Among the 56 American pilots spread across the French sky that morning were men who would become legends in their own right, future aces whose names would eventually strike a cold, primal fear into Luftwaffe hearts. Robert Johnson, who would survive damage that should have been instantly fatal. Hub Zemke, who would develop the tactics that would make the Thunderbolt unstoppable. Francis Gebreski, who would become America's top ace in Europe. But on April 8, 1943, they were novices in an untested machine, facing the most experienced, battle-hardened fighter force the world had ever seen. The Germans had been fighting continuously since September 1939, with veterans who'd survived Poland, France, the Battle of Britain, and the meat grinder of the Russian front. Men who'd learned their craft through 4 years of constant combat, who could judge deflection angles instinctively, who knew exactly how much lead to give a target at any speed or altitude. The Americans? They'd been in combat for exactly 0 days. They were children playing at war, and the Germans knew it. This is the story of how industrial logic defeated tactical brilliance. How quantity and quality merged into something approaching divine retribution. How German pilots' laughter turned to screams of terror as they discovered what 8 synchronized Browning machine guns could do to an aircraft at 400 yards. How the American way of war, brutal, mechanical, overwhelming, buried the Luftwaffe under an avalanche of lead and shattered the myth of German fighters' superiority forever. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had emerged from a June 1940 panic that gripped the U.S. military establishment like ice water down the spine. As German fighters swept across France with a speed and violence that shocked the world, Alexander Kartveli, Republic Aviation's brilliant Georgian-born chief designer, a man who thought in 3 dimensions and dreamed in aluminum, received urgent specifications from the U.S. Army Air Forces. They wanted a high-altitude interceptor capable of matching the Luftwaffe's best. What Kartveli designed instead was a monster that redefined what was possible in aviation engineering. "It will be a dinosaur," he admitted to his design team during one late-night session, cigarette smoke curling around blueprints spread across every available surface. "But it will be a dinosaur with perfect proportions." He had no idea how prophetic those words would prove. The XP-47B prototype that first flew on May 6, 1941, shocked everyone who laid eyes on it. At 9,900 pounds empty, it weighed 65% more than its predecessor, the P-43 Lancer. The massive turbo-supercharger system, with its complex ducting running through the rear fuselage like mechanical intestines, gave it an almost pregnant appearance that inspired crude jokes among factory workers. The massive radial engine dominated the nose like the snout of some prehistoric predator. Test pilots approaching it for the first time invariably paused, studying the massive machine from every angle, then asked the same question with genuine concern in their voices. "This thing actually flies?" The doubt was written on every face. It looked too heavy, too big, too wrong to possibly leave the ground, much less fight. Not only did it fly, it flew like nothing else at altitude, transforming into something graceful and deadly once it reached the thin air where other fighters gasped and struggled. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, an 18-cylinder radial masterpiece producing 2,000 horsepower, each cylinder precisely machined and balanced, could maintain full power at 27,000 feet, altitudes where German fighters' engines wheezed like old men climbing stairs. The turbo supercharger, fed by exhaust gases spinning turbines at impossible speeds, delivered sea-level performance in the stratosphere where the air was too thin for conventional superchargers to function effectively. It was engineering brilliance wrapped in brute force, American ingenuity applied to the ancient problem of making heavy things fly high and fast. Major Hubert Hub Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group during their training at Bridgeport, Connecticut, initially despised the aircraft with a passion that bordered on hatred. His unit lost 18 pilots and 41 aircraft in training accidents between September 1942 and January 1943, young men who'd survived flight school only to die learning to fly the beast that was supposed to keep them alive in combat. The P-47 killed more Americans in training than Germans would manage in the first brutal months of combat operations. It ground-looped on landing with vicious unpredictability, the massive torque of that enormous propeller catching pilots off guard. It torque-rolled on takeoff if you weren't ready for it, flipping over and cartwheeling across the runway in explosions of aluminum and aviation fuel. And it dove with such terrifying enthusiasm that pilots discovered compressibility effects firsthand, their controls freezing solid as shock waves formed on the wings, the aircraft shuddering and bucking like it was trying to tear itself apart. But those who mastered it, those who survived the learning curve and understood what they were actually flying, discovered something extraordinary that changed their entire understanding of aerial combat. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, a quiet farm boy from Oklahoma who would become one of America's top aces with 27 victories, each one earned through skill, courage, and the durability of his aircraft, described his first flight with words that stayed with him for life. "It was like strapping yourself to a locomotive that someone had given wings," he said years later, the memory still vivid in his eyes. "The power was unbelievable, almost frightening. You didn't fly it like other fighters, you aimed it, pointed it at the enemy, and held on while physics did the rest." The first combat encounters in April and May 1943 confirmed every German prejudice about the fat American fighter, validating months of dismissive intelligence reports. The P-47s couldn't turn with the Focke-Wulf 190s, not even close. In a turning fight, the German fighters could complete 2 full circles before a Thunderbolt finished one, leaving American pilots desperately trying to follow adversaries who seemed to vanish into thin air. They couldn't climb with the Messerschmitt Bf 109s at medium altitudes, watching helplessly as German fighters zoomed away vertically like rockets while the heavy Thunderbolts clawed for altitude like they were climbing through molasses. And they certainly couldn't match the nimble handling characteristics that made German fighters extensions of their pilots' thoughts. Luftwaffe pilots, their confidence boosted by years of victories, quickly developed tactics specifically designed to exploit these glaring weaknesses. They attacked from below where the heavy Thunderbolts struggled most, forcing turning fights where agility mattered infinitely more than firepower, where being able to point your nose mattered more than how many guns were mounted in your wings. Hauptmann Joseph Pips Priller, commanding officer of Jägerschwader 26 and a man whose arrogance was matched only by his skill in combat, reported to headquarters after his first encounter with undisguised contempt dripping from every word. "The new American fighter is meat for the slaughter," he wrote in his after-action report, probably smiling as he penned each word. "It flies like a truck hauling concrete, turns like a freight train on rusty rails, and climbs like a pregnant cow struggling uphill. Our boys are calling them Indianer, fat targets pretending to be warriors. They'll learn their mistakes soon enough, written in blood across French skies." The statistics from those early weeks seemed to confirm German confidence with brutal clarity. In their first month of operations, the American fighter groups lost 14 Thunderbolts, for only 3 confirmed German kills, a ratio that would have been utterly humiliating if it had continued. The RAF, observing from their Spitfire squadrons with barely concealed smugness, quietly suggested through diplomatic channels that the Americans might want to reconsider their choice of mount before too many young pilots paid the ultimate price. British pilots, gathered in their mess halls over warm beer, joked that the best evasive maneuver in a P-47 was to unstrap from your seat and run around the roomy cockpit, hoping the German pilot would die laughing before he got his guns lined up. But something strange was happening in those early encounters, something the German intelligence analysts, brilliant men studying combat reports in underground bunkers, failed to notice or simply couldn't believe. The P-47s that were shot down had absorbed incredible, almost impossible amounts of punishment before finally falling from the sky. Damage that should have been instantly catastrophic seemed to barely affect the massive fighters. One aircraft returned from a May 4th mission with 21 cannon holes punched completely through the fuselage, and over 100 machine gun strikes peppering every surface. The crew chief who examined it stood silent for nearly 5 minutes, just walking around the battered fighter, trying to understand how it had stayed in the air. Damage that would have disintegrated a Messerschmitt into falling debris or torn a Spitfire's delicate structure apart like wet paper had been absorbed, distributed through the Thunderbolt's massively over-engineered airframe like a boxer rolling with punches. The massive radial engine, lacking the vulnerable coolant systems that made liquid-cooled fighters so fragile, could take hits that would have stopped a Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf cold, their engines seizing in seconds as coolant sprayed and temperatures soared. German pilots were accustomed to a single well-placed cannon shell into an engine compartment ending a fight instantly. The P-47's radial just absorbed the damage, maybe lost a cylinder or two, and kept running with a roughness that shook the entire airframe but still produced power. More significantly, and this was what truly worried the few German pilots who were paying attention, when P-47s did manage to get their guns on target, the results were absolutely catastrophic in ways that defied previous combat experience. The Thunderbolt's weapons battery created a convergence zone of destruction that German pilots had never experienced, even in years of combat across multiple fronts. Unlike the rifle-caliber weapons of early war fighters that required sustained fire to be truly effective, or the cannon with their devastating individual hits but painfully limited ammunition, typically only enough for a few bursts before running dry, the first combat encounters in April and May 1943 confirmed every German prejudice about the fat American fighter, validating months of dismissive intelligence reports. The P-47s couldn't turn with the Focke-Wulf 190s, not even close. In a turning fight, the German fighters could complete 2 full circles before a Thunderbolt finished one, leaving American pilots desperately trying to follow adversaries who seemed to vanish into thin air. They couldn't climb with the Messerschmitt Bf 109s at medium altitudes, watching helplessly as German fighters zoomed away vertically like rockets while the heavy Thunderbolts clawed for altitude like they were climbing through molasses. And they certainly couldn't match the nimble handling characteristics that made German fighters extensions of their pilots' thoughts. Luftwaffe pilots, their confidence boosted by years of victories, quickly developed tactics specifically designed to exploit these glaring weaknesses. They attacked from below where the heavy Thunderbolts struggled most, forcing turning fights where agility mattered infinitely more than firepower, where being able to point your nose mattered more than how many guns were mounted in your wings. Hauptmann Joseph Pips Priller, commanding officer of Jägerschwader 26 and a man whose arrogance was matched only by his skill in combat, reported to headquarters after his first encounter with undisguised contempt dripping from every word. "The new American fighter is meat for the slaughter," he wrote in his after-action report, probably smiling as he penned each word. "It flies like a truck hauling concrete, turns like a freight train on rusty rails, and climbs like a pregnant cow struggling uphill. Our boys are calling them Indianer, fat targets pretending to be warriors. They'll learn their mistakes soon enough, written in blood across French skies." The statistics from those early weeks seemed to confirm German confidence with brutal clarity. In their first month of operations, the American fighter groups lost 14 Thunderbolts, for only 3 confirmed German kills, a ratio that would have been utterly humiliating if it had continued. The RAF, observing from their Spitfire squadrons with barely concealed smugness, quietly suggested through diplomatic channels that the Americans might want to reconsider their choice of mount before too many young pilots paid the ultimate price. British pilots, gathered in their mess halls over warm beer, joked that the best evasive maneuver in a P-47 was to unstrap from your seat and run around the roomy cockpit, hoping the German pilot would die laughing before he got his guns lined up. But something strange was happening in those early encounters, something the German intelligence analysts, brilliant men studying combat reports in underground bunkers, failed to notice or simply couldn't believe. The P-47s that were shot down had absorbed incredible, almost impossible amounts of punishment before finally falling from the sky. Damage that should have been instantly catastrophic seemed to barely affect the massive fighters. One aircraft returned from a May 4th mission with 21 cannon holes punched completely through the fuselage, and over 100 machine gun strikes peppering every surface. The crew chief who examined it stood silent for nearly 5 minutes, just walking around the battered fighter, trying to understand how it had stayed in the air. Damage that would have disintegrated a Messerschmitt into falling debris or torn a Spitfire's delicate structure apart like wet paper had been absorbed, distributed through the Thunderbolt's massively over-engineered airframe like a boxer rolling with punches. The massive radial engine, lacking the vulnerable coolant systems that made liquid-cooled fighters so fragile, could take hits that would have stopped a Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf cold, their engines seizing in seconds as coolant sprayed and temperatures soared. German pilots were accustomed to a single well-placed cannon shell into an engine compartment ending a fight instantly. The P-47's radial just absorbed the damage, maybe lost a cylinder or two, and kept running with a roughness that shook the entire airframe but still produced power. More significantly, and this was what truly worried the few German pilots who were paying attention, when P-47s did manage to get their guns on target, the results were absolutely catastrophic in ways that defied previous combat experience. The Thunderbolt's weapons battery created a convergence zone of destruction that German pilots had never experienced, even in years of combat across multiple fronts. Unlike the rifle-caliber weapons of early war fighters that required sustained fire to be truly effective, or the cannon with their devastating individual hits but painfully limited ammunition, typically only enough for a few bursts before running dry, the American fighter could maintain sustained, overwhelming fire for over 30 seconds. In aerial combat, where most firing opportunities lasted 2 or 3 seconds at most, 30 seconds was an eternity. It meant you could correct your aim, walk your fire onto target, and absolutely guarantee the enemy's destruction. The event that would begin fundamentally changing German perceptions occurred on June 26, 1943, over Évreux, France. It involved 2nd Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 61st Fighter Squadron and an encounter that would become legendary on both sides of the conflict, told and retold until it achieved almost mythical status, except every word was documented, verified, and absolutely true. Johnson's formation of 8 P-47s was returning from escort duty, the pilots tired and looking forward to debriefing and hot food, when they were bounced by 16 Focke-Wulf 190s from 2/JG-26, led by Hauptmann Wilhelm Ferdinand, Watts, Galland, younger brother of the famous Adolf Galland and every bit as skilled, perhaps even more aggressive. The Germans executed a textbook perfect attack, diving from the sun with overwhelming speed advantage, the kind of bounce that should have ended with multiple American kills before the victims even knew they were under attack. Johnson's Thunderbolt, flying tail end Charlie at the rear of the formation, the most vulnerable position, the slot that often meant death, was caught in the crossfire of multiple attackers. He had perhaps 1 second of warning, a glint of sun on canopy, before his world exploded. 20 20mm cannon shells detonated across his aircraft in the span of heartbeats. The canopy shattered into 1,000 glittering fragments, filling the cockpit with flying glass. Hydraulic fluid sprayed into the cockpit under pressure, coating everything in slippery, stinking fluid. The engine cowling was torn away like paper, tumbling away into the slipstream. Fire erupted behind the instrument panel, flames licking at his legs, smoke filling what was left of the enclosed space. Johnson, wounded in the nose and leg by shrapnel and bullet fragments, hot metal that burned like coals pressed against skin, tried desperately to bail out, yanking at the canopy release with hands that wouldn't quite respond properly. But he discovered in that moment of pure terror that the canopy was jammed solid. A 20mm shell had exploded directly in the canopy track, the blast welding metal to metal. He was trapped in a dying aircraft at 27,000 feet, and the only direction to go was down. What happened next defied every assumption about combat damage tolerance, everything anyone thought they knew about how much punishment an aircraft could absorb. Despite having essentially the survival of Johnson's aircraft sent shock waves through both air forces with the force of an earthquake. American engineers studying the wreckage in disbelief realized they had fundamentally underestimated their own creation. They'd built something stronger than they'd intended, more resilient than their calculations predicted. German intelligence, receiving detailed combat reports from multiple pilots of 2/JG-26, men whose word was trusted, whose observations had proven accurate countless times, initially refused to believe it. No aircraft could absorb that much punishment. It was physically impossible. The reports had to be exaggerated, inflated by the fog of combat and overactive imaginations. But testimony from multiple pilots, men who had nothing to gain from lying, confirmed the impossible. The Thunderbolt had taken everything the Luftwaffe's best fighter could deliver, hundreds of rounds, dozens of cannon shells, and it had survived. More than survived. It had flown home. By July 1943, American pilots were finally learning to exploit the P-47's true strengths through brutal trial and error, each lesson written in blood. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke, the 56th Fighter Group commander whose initial hatred of the aircraft had transformed into grudging respect and then genuine affection, had discovered the secret. He gathered his pilots and told them bluntly, with the kind of honesty that saved lives. Don't turn with them. Don't climb with them at low altitude. Use your weight. Use your power. Use your guns. Fight the American way, not theirs. The Thunderbolt's massive weight, initially seen as a crippling disadvantage, became a devastating weapon once pilots understood how to employ it. In a dive, nothing in the German inventory could catch it. From 30,000 feet, a P-47 could reach 550 miles per hour, faster than any German fighter could achieve even in a vertical dive. This speed could be converted to altitude in a zoom climb that left pursuing fighters helplessly behind, their engines gasping in the thin air while the turbo-supercharged Thunderbolt climbed away like it was on rails. Captain Walker, Bud Mahurin, who would become one of the first American aces in Europe with a combat style that was part science, part art, developed what became known as the boom and zoom tactic, though pilots quickly nicknamed it the Thunderbolt turkey shoot. Instead of engaging in traditional turning dogfights where German fighters held every advantage, P-47 formations would climb to 30,000 feet or higher, altitudes where German fighters operated poorly, their engines struggling for air. When Luftwaffe fighters appeared below them, the Thunderbolts would roll inverted and dive, building speed that made deflection shooting nearly impossible for defending Germans. At the bottom of these dives, traveling at speeds that made the entire aircraft shake, the American heavy machine guns would speak their piece. And when they spoke, Germans died. German pilots who survived these encounters described it in their combat reports with words that conveyed genuine terror. Facing a wall of lead, an impenetrable zone of destruction that turned aircraft into scrap metal and men into memories. The combined firepower, all 8 guns converging on a single point, created devastation that had to be seen to be believed. Aircraft caught in this convergence pattern didn't just fall, they disintegrated, literally came apart in midair as structures failed under the hammering impact. The true revelation of American firepower came during the August 17, 1943 dual raid on Schweinfurt and Regensburg, the deepest penetration into Germany attempted to that date, a mission that would demonstrate both the P-47's critical limitations and its terrifying effectiveness when employed properly. The range problem was real. Even with drop tanks, the Thunderbolts could only escort the bombers partway into Germany before fuel considerations forced them to turn back, leaving the bombers to face the full fury of the Luftwaffe alone. Major David Schilling, leading the 62nd Fighter Squadron with the kind of aggressive leadership that inspired loyalty and fear in equal measure, encountered a formation of Messerschmitt Bf-110 destroyer aircraft positioning to attack B-17s with their heavy cannons and rocket armament. The twin-engine German fighters, heavily armed but less maneuverable than single-engine types, were the Luftwaffe's specialized bomber killers, deadly to flying fortresses but vulnerable to fighters. Schilling's flight of 4 Thunderbolts rolled into their attack dive from 28,000 feet, falling like hammers from heaven. Unteroffizier Heinrich Roth, a gunner in one of the Bf-110s who somehow survived what came next, later recounted the encounter during POW interrogation, his voice hollow with remembered terror. The American fighters came down like meteors, faster than anything I'd ever seen. I opened fire at 800 meters, good hits, I saw strikes sparking on the leader's wing. The P-47 didn't even wobble, just kept coming like nothing had happened. Then he fired. Roth paused in his testimony, struggling with the memory. The aircraft ahead of us simply came apart. Not shot down, destroyed. Wings separated from fuselage, tails severed cleanly, the crew compartment shredded into metal confetti. In 2 seconds, maybe less, a Bf-110 became nothing but falling debris. I've never seen anything like it. 8 Messerschmitt Bf-110s were destroyed in less than a minute, an entire staffel effectively eliminated in the time it took to blink. The German pilots, many of them veterans with years of experience, had never experienced such concentrated, overwhelming firepower. It was like facing artillery in the sky. Each P-47 carried 425 rounds per gun. 3,400 rounds total, weighing nearly 900 pounds. At convergence distance, typically set between 250 and 350 yards depending on pilot preference, all 8 guns' ballistic paths intersected in a zone roughly 6 feet in diameter. Anything caught in that zone faced 100 half-inch projectiles per second, each traveling at 2,900 feet per second. The math was simple and brutal: nothing survived. The ammunition itself represented a revelation of American industrial capacity that German planners simply couldn't match. While German fighters struggled with severely limited cannon ammunition, typically 120 to 200 rounds for a 20mm weapon, enough for perhaps 5 good bursts before running dry, American pilots could maintain continuous fire for over half a minute. The standard combat load mixed armor-piercing incendiary tracer, and standard ball ammunition in patterns designed to both destroy and ignite, turning enemy aircraft into pyres. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gay Bresky, who would become the top American ace in Europe with 28 victories and a combat style that blended caution with sudden, overwhelming aggression, described the effect with words that became famous among Thunderbolt pilots. "When you hit them with all 8 guns, they don't just go down, they explode. I saw 109 literally cut in half, the tail section spinning one way, the nose and wings tumbling another. The pilot never had a chance to bail out, never knew what hit him. One moment he was there, flying and fighting. The next moment, he just wasn't." By September 1943, the Luftwaffe was discovering another horrifying reality about the P-47 that would fundamentally change the air war over Europe. Its performance improved dramatically with altitude while German fighters suffered progressive degradation. The turbo-supercharged double Wasp engine maintained its full rated power output up to 30,000 feet and beyond. German fighters, relying on single-stage or two-stage mechanical superchargers, saw their performance fall off a cliff above 25,000 feet, exactly where the Americans wanted to fight. Oberleutnant Hans Philipp, one of Germany's most successful aces with 206 victories accumulated across multiple fronts, encountered this reality with fatal consequences on October 8, 1943. Leading Jagdgeschwader 1 against AB-17 formation at 28,000 feet over Bremen, Philipp found his Focke-Wulf 190A6 sluggish and barely responsive in the thin air. The BMW 801 engine, tremendously powerful at medium altitudes where it dominated, was gasping for oxygen nearly 6 miles above the Earth. When P-47s of the 56th Fighter Group dove on his formation from 32,000 feet, an altitude where the Thunderbolts still had full power while the German fighters were nearly helpless, the result was slaughter. Robert Johnson, now an experienced combat pilot well on his way to ace status, his earlier near-death experience having taught him lessons he'd never forget, was flying top cover at 31,000 feet when he spotted Philipp's distinctive Focke-Wulf with its elaborate nose art. Johnson's combat report, filed hours later, was clinical in its brevity. Opened fire at 300 yards, 30-degree deflection. Observed strikes along entire fuselage. Enemy aircraft exploded. No parachute observed. Behind those dry words lay the death of one of Germany's finest. Philipp's death sent shock waves through the Luftwaffe that reached the highest levels of command. If one of their very best, a man who had survived over 500 combat missions on both eastern and western fronts, who had faced the best pilots Britain and Russia could field, couldn't survive against the Thunderbolts at high altitude, what chance did average pilots have? What hope remained? The German High Command ordered an immediate, comprehensive investigation into the P-47's capabilities. The report delivered to Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring in November 1943 made for sobering reading that shattered assumptions and destroyed confidence. The Thunderbolt's service ceiling exceeded 42,000 feet, higher than any operational German fighter could reach. Its dive speed approached the sound barrier. Its armor included 3/8-inch steel plate behind the pilot, half-inch bulletproof glass windscreen, and armored deflection plates around the engine compartment. Most disturbingly for German strategic planning, Its rugged construction allowed it to absorb damage that would destroy 3 conventional fighters and still return home to fight again the next day. The Americans weren't just building good fighters, they were building nearly indestructible ones. In January 1944, a new variant of the P-47 began arriving in England that would complete the transformation from laughingstock to nightmare. The P-47D-22 featured a Hamilton standard hydromatic propeller with paddle blades, 13 feet in diameter with broadcord blades that bit into the air like massive oars pulling through water. The improvement in climb rate was immediate, dramatic, and changed everything about how the Thunderbolt fought. Where earlier Thunderbolts had climbed at an anemic 2,200 feet per minute at sea level, respectable but not impressive, the paddleblade variants could achieve 3,000 feet per minute, matching or exceeding German fighters at most altitudes. The massive propeller also improved acceleration dramatically, allowing P-47s to build energy faster in level flight, to recover from maneuvers quicker, to press attacks more aggressively. Hauptmann Heinz Nock of Jägerschwader 11, a veteran with over 200 combat missions and a man who learned to read combat situations with uncanny accuracy, encountered the new variants in February 1944 during a bomber interception near Hanover. He wrote in his combat diary that night, his handwriting betraying the stress of the day. "The fat American fighters have learned to climb. We bounced a formation near Hanover at dawn, expecting our usual advantage in vertical maneuvers. They turned into us and climbed with us, stayed with us all the way to 30,000 feet. When we tried to disengage using our superior climb rate, they followed us up. Schmidt was caught and blown apart. Nothing left but smoke and fragments. These are not the same machines we laughed at last year. They've evolved into something terrifying." The paddle blade propeller did more than improve performance. It changed the sound of the Thunderbolt in ways that affected German morale profoundly. The distinctive thundering roar, created by the blade tips reaching transonic speeds, could be heard from miles away. It was a deep, threatening rumble that announced death approaching. German ground troops reported being able to identify approaching P-47s by sound alone, long before they appeared in the sky. They began calling it Donnerschlag thunderclap. The sound that meant take cover immediately or die. By March 1944, P-47s equipped with external fuel tanks could escort bombers deep into Germany, finally solving the range problem that had protected German industry. The standard configuration carried 2 108-gallon wing tanks or a single 75-gallon belly tank, extending combat radius to over 1,000 miles. With the paddle blade propeller providing improved performance even when loaded down with external tanks, Thunderbolts could fight on equal terms immediately after dropping tanks. No vulnerable period, no easy kills. The Luftwaffe's response was to concentrate exclusively on the bombers, hoping to inflict enough losses to stop the American daylight campaign before German cities were reduced to rubble. But this required flying directly through the P-47 escort screen, an increasingly suicidal proposition that veteran pilots approached with dread. German pilots developed a grudging respect that bordered on genuine fear for the big American fighters. Major Gunther Rall, one of Germany's top aces with 275 victories mostly on the Eastern Front where different rules applied, survived an encounter with P-47s on March 6, 1944, that left him badly wounded and permanently changed his perspective. He recalled years later in a post-war interview, his voice still carrying the weight of that day. "We saw them above us, fat silhouettes against the sun. Someone in my staffel laughed and said over the radio, 'Here come the flying pigs.' Nobody was laughing 30 seconds later. They came down like an avalanche, faster than we could possibly react. The first pass destroyed 3 of our fighters, just gone, transformed into burning debris falling toward the earth." Rall paused, touching the scars on his face unconsciously. "Their guns didn't fire in bursts like ours, conserving ammunition. They poured out solid streams of fire, continuous, relentless. Getting caught in that stream meant instant death, not probable death, certain death. I took hits that should have killed me. My aircraft was a flying wreck. I barely made it back." The escort missions revealed another crucial P-47 advantage that German planners hadn't anticipated: endurance. While German fighters operated at maximum power settings that consumed fuel at alarming rates, forcing them to break off combat after minutes, the big American radios could cruise efficiently at high altitude for hours. Thunderbolts could remain with the bombers throughout the mission, rotating top cover positions while maintaining enough fuel reserve for extended combat and the return journey. It was relentless, grinding pressure that wore down German fighter strength through sheer persistence. As more P-51 Mustangs arrived in spring 1944 to take over long-range escort duties with their even greater range, P-47 units increasingly focused on ground attack, a role that would make them the most feared aircraft in the entire German arsenal, more terrifying than heavy bombers, more deadly than any other Allied weapons system. The transition began in earnest in April 1944 as the Allies prepared for the invasion of France. The Thunderbolt's heavy machine gun battery, designed for air-to-air combat, proved equally devastating against ground targets. The standard armor-piercing incendiary ammunition could penetrate the top armor of most German vehicles. Tanks were vulnerable from above, where armor was thinnest. The sheer volume of fire could destroy soft targets in seconds. A 2-second burst put 160 half-inch projectiles into a target area the size of a truck. Nothing survived that concentration of fire. But it was the addition of bombs and rockets that transformed the P-47 into a true multi-role monster that could perform missions previously requiring dedicated attack aircraft. The D-25 variant could carry two 1,000-pound bombs under the wings and a 500-pounder under the fuselage, a bomb load equal to early war medium bombers. Later variants added zero-length rocket stubs for 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, each equivalent in destructive power to a 105 mm artillery shell. Oberst Hans von Luck, commanding the 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment during the Normandy campaign, experienced P-47 ground attacks firsthand. His account, recorded in his memoirs decades later, still conveyed the terror of those moments. They came in low, so low you could see the pilots' faces, see them looking down at you through their canopies. The sound was terrifying, engines roaring like demons, rockets screaming as they launched. Then came the hammer of those heavy machine guns, a sound you never forget. A column of our trucks simply ceased to exist. 20 vehicles transformed into burning wreckage in one pass. The psychological effect on the men was devastating. Veterans who'd survived years on the Eastern Front broke down crying. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, the Luftwaffe discovered how completely the balance of power had shifted. Over 500 P-47s provided air cover for the invasion, creating an impenetrable umbrella over the beaches that extended from wave-top height to 30,000 feet. German fighters attempting to reach the landing zones were massacred before they could threaten the vulnerable troops below. Oberleutnant Wolfgang Fischer of Jägerschwader II, one of only 3 German pilots to actually reach the beaches that day out of dozens who tried, reported in his debriefing with a voice that shook. The sky belonged to the Americans. Thunderbolts were stacked from sea level to the stratosphere. We tried to break through at dawn, 12 fighters from our group. I was the only one to return. The P-47s were waiting at every altitude. You couldn't climb over them. Couldn't dive under them. Their guns turned our fighters into aluminum rain. In the weeks following D-Day, P-47s systematically destroyed German movement capability in daylight hours. The statistics were staggering, almost impossible to believe. In June 1944 alone, 9th Air Force Thunderbolts claimed 651 locomotives destroyed, 3,847 trucks, 512 tanks and armored vehicles, and 4,553 horse-drawn vehicles. The Wehrmacht was forced to move only at night, severely hampering their ability to respond to Allied advances, to reinforce threatened sectors, to conduct the mobile warfare at which they'd excelled. The Germans tried everything to counter the Thunderbolt threat. They reinforced vehicle armor. It wasn't enough. They deployed more anti-aircraft guns. The P-47s were too fast and too well armored. They developed new camouflage techniques. The American pilots adapted. Nothing worked. The P-47's combination of speed, armor, and firepower made them nearly unstoppable once they committed to an attack. Perhaps the ultimate vindication of the P-47's evolution came in its encounters with German jet fighters. The Messerschmitt Me-262, with its revolutionary 540 mph top speed, should have been completely untouchable by propeller-driven fighters, a weapon from the future facing weapons from the past. But Thunderbolt pilots discovered they could catch jets in two critical situations: during takeoff and landing when jets were most vulnerable, their speed advantage negated, and in high-speed dives from altitude where the P-47's tremendous weight became an asset. On November 27, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer of the 352nd Fighter Group became one of the first pilots to shoot down an Me-262 with a P-47. Diving from 28,000 feet, Meyer's Thunderbolt reached speeds approaching 500 miles per hour, fast enough to catch the jet in level flight during its attack run. The jet pilot, confident in his massive speed advantage and probably never imagining a propeller fighter could threaten him, never saw the diving P-47 until Meyer's guns opened up at 400 yards. Meyer's combat report noted with satisfaction: the enemy aircraft disintegrated under fire. Large pieces, including both engines, separated from the fuselage. The pilot did not escape. The concentrated fire of 8.50 caliber guns proved devastatingly effective against jet aircraft. Their speed means nothing if they can't maneuver and can't take hits. The ultimate demonstration of American industrial might came during Operation Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe's desperate, all-or-nothing attempt to destroy Allied air power on January 1, 1945. Nearly 900 German fighters, including their best remaining pilots and irreplaceable instructors, launched surprise attacks on Allied airfields across Belgium and the Netherlands in what would be the Luftwaffe's last major offensive operation. At Y-34 airfield near Metz, home to the 365th Fighter Group's P-47s, the attack initially succeeded. German fighters destroyed 22 Thunderbolts on the ground along with several other aircraft, strafing parked planes and support facilities. A captured German pilot, brought to the command post with his hands zip-tied, pointed at the burning aircraft and taunted the Americans. "What do you think of that? Your precious fighters burning!" Major George Brooking's response became legendary throughout the 9th Air Force, repeated in mess halls and briefing rooms for months afterward. He pointed calmly to the flight line where ground crews were already pushing damaged aircraft aside and preparing hard stands for replacements. "By tomorrow morning, we'll have 40 new ones flown in from depots in England. How long will it take you to replace your pilots?" The German pilot's smirk disappeared instantly as the implications sank in. Within 48 hours, factory-fresh P-47D-40s filled the flight line, flown in from seemingly inexhaustible reserves. The Luftwaffe lost 271 aircraft and 213 pilots in Bodenplatte, losses they could never, ever replace. The Americans lost 134 aircraft total across all attacked airfields, every single one replaced within a week, as if they'd never been destroyed. The numbers told the story of inevitable, mathematical defeat. Republic Aviation produced 15,683 P-47s during the war, more than any other American fighter. At peak production in 1944, the Farmingdale factory on Long Island completed one Thunderbolt every 60 minutes, around the clock, 7 days a week. The Evansville plant in Indiana, built from empty farmland in 1942, was producing 500 aircraft monthly by 1944. The scale was incomprehensible to German planners. In March 1945, Oberst Joseph Priller, the same pilot who had mocked the P-47s as pregnant cows 2 years earlier, was interviewed by German propaganda officials desperately seeking to boost morale. His statement, deemed too demoralizing for publication and buried in archives, revealed the complete transformation in German attitudes. "The Thunderbolt is the best fighter bomber ever built. Its firepower is unprecedented, 8 guns that never jam, never overheat, never run out of ammunition in normal combat. It carries bombs like a medium bomber, fires rockets like artillery, and fights like a heavy fighter when needed. But beyond the machine is what it represents, unlimited American production. They lose 10, they build 20. We lose 1, it's gone forever. Their pilots arrive better trained than our instructors. They have fuel for training, ammunition for practice, spare parts for everything. We have nothing but courage. And courage without resources is just delayed defeat. By April 1945, the Luftwaffe existed largely on paper. Fuel shortages grounded most aircraft. Experienced pilots were dead, captured, or too wounded to fly. Airfields were cratered ruins. The thunder had spoken, and Germany had lost. The P-47 Thunderbolt entered combat as an object of derision and ended the war as an instrument of annihilation. In between, 8 synchronized Browning machine guns rewrote the rules of aerial warfare and buried the Luftwaffe under an avalanche of American steel and lead. German pilots had laughed at the ungainly American fighter in April 1943. By May 1945, there were no German pilots left to laugh.